Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Because this story might just stay with you forever, especially if you've ever loved a dog or held a sleeping baby so close. You could feel their breath against your chest and prayed nothing would ever go wrong. And especially if you believe that sometimes, when the world is quiet, something we don't understand is still watching over us. And that's exactly what this story is about. A quiet home, a peaceful family, and a dog no one expected to become a hero, because it all began on a normal Tuesday, in a small town where the roads were wide and the street lamps glowed a soft orange at night, and where Emily and Jordan Miller had just welcomed their first child, a baby girl named Ava, just 7 weeks old, soft as a feather, barely 6 pounds, with fingers that curled instinctively around her mother's thumb and eyelashes so long they brushed her cheeks when she blinked in their house. A modest one-story with white siding and a porch swing that creaked when the wind blew was the kind of place people drove past and smiled at, the kind of place where someone always left. The porch light on, and on the couch, sprawled out like he owned the place, was Scout, their golden Labrador retriever. 6 years old, with a broad head, gentle eyes, the kind of calm that only dogs who've seen their family through everything seem to carry. And to the Millers, Scout wasn't just a dog, he was family. He was the one who'd curled up beside Emily when she'd cried after her miscarriage 2 years ago. He was the one who'd rested his head on Jordan's lap during those long nights of financial worry when he wasn't sure how they'd afford the baby, the one who had followed Emily from room to room during her pregnancy like her silent bodyguard. And now, after all that time, Scout had taken it upon himself to sleep in front of the nursery door, not because anyone asked him to, but because he wanted to. Because every night, after Ava had been tucked into her crib and the lullabies faded into silence, Scout would lay down with his head against the hardwood floor, ears relaxed but alert, eyes occasionally blinking as if even in sleep he was listening, and it became routine. The soft sounds of the baby monitor buzzing on the nightstand, the warm yellow nightlight glowing beneath the crib, Scout's breathing slow and steady. A metronome of peace, and Emily in her exhaustion would sometimes wake up just to peek at the monitor, see the small rise and fall of Ava's chest, and fall back asleep with a quiet sigh, and Jordan would roll over and place a hand on her waist. Both of them grateful, deeply, achingly grateful for the quiet they had, the health of their baby, and the sense that life, after all the chaos, had finally settled into something gentle. And it stayed like that for weeks, days that blurred into nights. Diapers and bottles and Scout's tail wagging gently at 4 a.m. feedings. And the house filled with that kind of joy that feels so fragile you don't talk about it out loud because maybe you're afraid you'll jinx it, but behind all of it, woven into every moment, was Scout, who never left her side, who sat beside the stroller when they walked in the park, who nudged Ava's feet gently when she cried, who stood between her and the front door when delivery people knocked, who looked at her the way only a dog can look at something it has chosen to protect for life, and what no one noticed, not at first, was how attentive Scout had become, how he would pause by the crib longer than usual, how he would sniff the air more than once, how his ears would flick even when the room was still, and how, on the night before it happened, he didn't. Sleep, not really. He paced in front of the nursery door, lay down, got up again, walked to the crib, and back to the hallway, as if something deep inside him was stirring, some ancient instinct that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with love. And the baby slept peacefully, or so they thought. Her tiny breath soft and rhythmic, her hands curled into fists near her face, and the monitor blinked calmly, and Emily and Jordan slept. Two, finally, for once deeply. Because Ava had fallen into a long stretch of sleep, and they needed it, desperately, and outside the wind picked up, brushing the porch swing against the railing, and the stars shone through the branches of the tall trees that lined their yard. And Scout stood there, silent, watching, waiting, sensing something no one else could, something not yet wrong but close. And in that stillness, in that impossibly quiet space between one breath and the next, something changed, something tiny, nearly imperceptible, like a note going off-key in the middle of a lullaby. And Scout's head snapped toward the crib, his body tensed, his ears tilted forward, and he took 3 slow steps into the nursery, stood beside the crib, and stared down, unmoving, eyes wide, breath shallow, and then he let out a single, low bark, not loud, not panicked, but urgent. And in the master bedroom, Emily stirred, blinked at the clock, 3:12 a.m., and sat up, groggy, thinking Scout had heard a raccoon or another delivery truck. But when she looked at the monitor, her heart stopped because Ava wasn't moving, not her arms, not her chest, not anything, and she screamed, not out of fear, but out of the deepest kind of terror a mother can know. And Jordan jolted awake, knocking over the lamp, and they both ran, barefoot and breathless, into the nursery, where Scout was now up on his hind legs, paws on the crib, whining, staring at Ava like he was willing her to move. And what happened next will be told for years in their family, because it changed everything they thought they knew about love, about protection, and about what dogs can sense. And that, dear listener, is where we begin. There are moments in life that split everything into before and after. And for Emily and Jordan Miller, 3:12 a.m. on that cold Thursday morning became that moment. Because in the seconds after Emily screamed and Scout barked again, louder this time, more urgent, more primal, the nursery filled with the kind of panic that has no sound except breathless gasps and trembling fingers. And as Jordan flipped the overhead light on, flooding the room with a harsh yellow glow, time seemed to both race and freeze. Because Ava was lying there still, far too still, her chest unmoving, her arms slack, her tiny face pale in a way no baby's face should be, and Emily didn't hesitate. She reached into the crib with shaking hands and lifted her baby to her chest, calling her name again and again, her voice cracking, her tears already falling, and Jordan grabbed the phone, dialing 911 with fingers that could barely press the buttons, and Scout. Oh, Scout didn't move away. He stayed right there, one paw still resting on the crib, his body trembling, not with fear, but with something deeper, something that looked like desperation, like pleading, like he was begging them to understand that this wasn't just a scare, that something real and terrifying was happening. And the 911 operator's voice came through the phone, calm and clear, giving instructions, asking questions, and Jordan followed them all, laying Ava flat on the nursery rug, checking for a pulse, listening for breath, and the silence that followed nearly shattered them, because there was no breath, no sound, just the steady metronome of Scout's pacing. Back and forth beside the baby, whining softly, his head low, and Emily dropped to her knees, placing 2 fingers on Ava's tiny sternum, beginning chest compressions with hands that couldn't stop shaking, counting aloud like the operator told her, and then blowing small breaths into her daughter's mouth, praying, begging, whispering, please, please, please. Between each attempt and outside, the sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder, cutting through the stillness of the neighborhood, waking porch lights and neighbors and porch dogs who barked in confusion. And still, Scout stayed close, circling once, then again. Then, doing something no one expected, he laid down beside Ava, nose to nose, as if trying to breathe for her, as if pushing warmth into her with every soft exhale, and Emily couldn't stop crying now, the kind of sobs that come from the deepest place a mother holds, the kind that tastes like fear and loss and guilt all at once. And Jordan, still on the phone, kept shouting updates to the operator, saying things like, no change. She's not responding. She's just a baby. And the sirens finally stopped outside, and within seconds the front door burst open and EMTs rushed in. Scout didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't move away. He just backed up slightly, letting them in, but watching with eyes that said, I was here first. I saw it first. And the paramedics took over, cutting open Ava's onesie, placing tiny pads on her chest, administering oxygen. The room became a whirlwind of wires and commands and cold medical urgency, and Emily clung to Jordan, her knuckles white from gripping his shirt, her lips moving in silent prayer. And Scout stood behind them now, his head resting against Emily's back, his body perfectly still. And then, just as the EMT was preparing the defibrillator, a small gasp filled the room, faint, fluttering but real, and everyone froze. The machine half assembled, hands suspended in midair, and they all leaned in as Ava's chest moved. Once, then again, a shallow inhale, followed by a tiny cough, and the EMT dropped to his knees beside her, checking vitals, whispering, "Come on, baby girl." And the pulse monitor beeped. Irregular but present, and Emily fell forward, her forehead against the floor, crying with relief, and Jordan sank beside her, pulling her close. Both of them laughing and sobbing and thanking every name of God they could think of. And Ava blinked slowly, her eyelids fluttering, her mouth opening just enough to let out a sound so small, yet so powerful, it brought everyone in the room to tears. Even the EMT, who'd seen more than his fair share of miracles and tragedies, and through it all, Scout didn't bark, didn't move. He just sat beside the baby, his tail thumping once against the floor. A single beat of calm amidst chaos, and the EMT looked at him, then at the parents, and said, "Is this your dog?" And Emily nodded, and he said, "You know, he was right." He knew before anyone else, and Jordan looked at Scout with a kind of awe that hadn't been there before. Like he was seeing him for the first time, not just as their pet, but as something else, something sacred, and Ava was lifted gently onto a stretcher. Swaddled in a blanket, her vitals monitored carefully, the EMTs carried her out to the waiting ambulance. And Emily climbed in after her, still barefoot, still shaking, and Jordan turned to Scout and said, "You're coming too." And Scout jumped into the back seat of the family car without hesitation, as if he knew this ride was the most important one of his life. And they followed the flashing lights all the way to the hospital, where doctors and nurses took over, and tests were run, and scans were taken. And hours passed in a blur of waiting rooms and hospital coffee, and tears that came without warning. And through it all, Scout stayed curled at Ava's crib in the pediatric ICU, watching, waiting, only occasionally lifting his head to rest it gently on Emily's knee or nuzzle Jordan's palm. When the final diagnosis came, a rare case of sleep apnea in newborns, undetected, dangerous, unpredictable. The doctor said if you hadn't gotten to her when you did. And Emily interrupted, her voice steady now, stronger than it had been all night, and said, "We didn't. He did." And she looked down at Scout, who was finally asleep, his body curled protectively around the base of Ava's hospital bed. And in that moment, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Not among the nurses who'd seen too much, or the doctors who usually hid their emotions. Because everyone understood that what had happened wasn't just a rescue. It was a testament to something deeper, to the bond between a dog and his family, to instincts that don't come from training but from love, and to the truth that sometimes the ones who save us don't speak our language, but they know our hearts better than we do. There's something strange about hospital time. How it stretches and contracts around hope and fear. How ours can feel like days when you're waiting for someone you love to wake up. And for Emily and Jordan, those first 48 hours after Ava was admitted were a blur of white walls, beeping monitors, the soft shuffling of nurses' shoes, and the ever-present sound of Scout's breathing curled beneath her bed. And it's hard to describe to someone who hasn't lived it, the ache of waiting for your child to stir, to cry, to do anything other than lie perfectly still with machines helping her breathe. But that's what those days were. Long stretches of silence interrupted only by updates from doctors and soft knocks on the door, and through all of it, Scout never left. Not for water, not for food, not even when the nurses offered treats, or when the hospital staff tried gently to coax him into the hallway for just a moment of rest, because Scout had already chosen his place, and that place was beside Ava, his chin sometimes resting on the edge of her crib, his eyes tracking every movement, and nurses began calling him the Watcher. It's not out of jest, but with reverence. Like they understood this wasn't just a dog sitting near a child. This was something else, something sacred, and every time a machine beeped, or Ava coughed in her sleep, or stirred even slightly, Scout's ears twitched, his body tensed, ready to move, and when Emily leaned over her daughter's crib, whispering lullabies with a voice worn thin from exhaustion and love, Scout would stand beside her, pressing his body into her legs like an anchor. Like he was saying, "I've got her too," and there were moments late at night, when Jordan sat by the window staring into the empty parking lot. Coffee cold in his hand, and Scout would walk over and place his head gently in his lap, and they'd sit like that for nearly an hour, no words, just presence. And slowly the hospital began to change around them. Doctors began poking their heads. And just to see the dog everyone was talking about, nurses asked to take their breaks in Ava's room just to be near him. And patients in other wards whispered about the golden retriever who saved a baby's life. And when the story got out, when one nurse posted a photo of Scout curled beside Ava's crib with a caption that read, "Guardian Angel, the post," went viral overnight, and suddenly the hospital's front desk was flooded with letters. Dog treats, stuffed animals, and even hand-drawn cards from children across the country saying things like, "Thank you for saving the baby," and "Scout, the brave, and I hope I grow up to be like you." And through it all, Scout remained unchanged, unmoved by the attention. Because all that mattered to him was Ava, and every day, when the doctors came in and did their rounds, when they checked her oxygen, her heart rate, her temperature, they would speak quietly, gently, as if trying not to disturb the dog, and more than once. They said things like, "We've never seen anything like this," because Ava, against all odds, was getting better. Not just surviving, but healing faster than expected. And while medicine played its part, while machines and expertise and sterile procedures mattered, everyone in that room believed, even if they couldn't explain it, that Scout had something to do with it, because there was something in the way Ava responded to his presence, how her vitals stabilized when he was near, how her fingers would curl unconsciously when his tail brushed the side of her crib, how her breathing would match his at times like she was syncing with him. And Emily noticed it too. Of course she did. She was a mother, and mothers feel what data can't measure. And one evening, 3 days into their stay, she sat in the chair beside Ava and began to cry again. Not from fear this time, but from overwhelming gratitude, from the realization that they had come so close to losing everything, and that this dog, this loyal, quiet, beautiful dog, had caught what they couldn't see, had acted before the machines, before the humans, before the world. And she reached down and placed her hand on Scout's back, whispering, "I don't know how to thank you." And he turned his head slightly, pressing his nose into her palm. For a moment she thought he might cry too, because his eyes looked different now, older somehow, tired in a way she couldn't name, like he had carried something heavy and was just now beginning to put it down. And Jordan, watching from across the room, snapped a photo, not because he wanted to share it, but because he never wanted to forget the way the light hit them in that moment. The mother, the baby, and the dog who refused to leave. And the next morning, when Ava opened her eyes and made a soft sound, a kind of high-pitched murmur that hadn't been heard in nearly 4 days, Scout was the first to move, standing instantly, tail wagging slowly, body rigid with attention, and Emily gasped and leaned over, calling Jordan from the hallway. And the doctor came in and confirmed what they had only dared hope. Ava was fully conscious, aware, responsive, and stable. And when they carried her out of ICU and into a private recovery room, they let Scout walk beside the wheelchair. A leash clipped loosely to his collar, but it wasn't needed, and other patients clapped softly from their doorways as they passed, whispering, "That's him, that's the one." And as Ava continued to recover over the next week, Scout finally allowed himself to rest, curling into a ball beside her bassinet in the new room, breathing deeply, ears relaxed, eyes finally closing without worry. And the nurses placed a little name tag on the door that said Ava plus Scout, and people continued to bring gifts. Not just for the baby now, but for the dog, plush beds, chew toys, even a donation in Scout's name to a national canine rescue group. And when the hospital director heard the full story, he arrived personally to ask if Scout could be honored in a small ceremony, and Jordan said yes, but only if it didn't disturb Ava. And the director smiled and said, "Of course, he's already done enough." And when the day came, a week after Ava had taken her first post-recovery nap in Emily's arms, the hospital lobby was filled with people, staff, patients, local reporters, and they presented Scout with a medal that read, "Loyal Protector, Lifesaver, Friend," and Jordan placed it around his neck as Emily held Ava, who was now looking around with those bright, curious baby eyes. And someone asked, "What are you going to do when you go home?" And Emily looked at Scout, then at Ava, and said, "We're going to live differently now. more slowly, with gratitude. And with him by her side every single step, and the lobby clapped, and Scout stood proudly beside his family, his tail wagging, not fast, just steady, like he knew he'd done what he was meant to do, like he understood. He had been seen not as a pet, not as a dog, but as a guardian, and that, maybe, was what Scout had been waiting for all along. There are bonds that form in silence, don't require words or promises or even understanding. And whatever lived between Scout and Ava after that night in the nursery was one of those bonds. The kind you feel more than you see, the kind that grows in the quiet moments in the space between a child's giggle and a dog's steady breath. And when they returned home from the hospital, with Scout still wearing the medal around his neck and Ava now cradled in the arms of her mother, like a fragile miracle. Everything was different, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in the soft shifts that changed the rhythm of a house. Like how Jordan no longer left early for work without kissing Scout on the head, or how Emily would pause longer beside the window. Each morning, just watching her daughter and the dog beside her, letting time slow for a while, and in those first few months, Ava slept more deeply than before, her vitals watched carefully, her every breath treasured, and Scout never let her out of his sight, not when she lay on the baby blanket beneath the living room window, not when she giggled in her bouncer, and especially not at night. When he resumed his post just outside her bedroom door, only now with a small cushion Emily had placed there, calling it his station. And the neighbors, too, began to change. Around them, perhaps because word had spread about what happened, or perhaps because seeing Scout walk with Ava in her stroller was like watching something out of a storybook. And people would stop to ask how she was doing, would bend down and scratch Scout behind the ears and whisper things like, "Thank you," and "Good boy," and "You really did it, didn't you?" And though Scout never responded with anything more than a blink or a soft tail wag, it always felt like he understood, like part of him was aware that the world had shifted slightly. And he was the quiet center of it, and Ava grew, as babies do, into a toddler with wide eyes and curious fingers. And her first word wasn't mama or dada, but ka, her small hand reaching towards Scout's tail as she wobbled on unsteady feet. And Emily cried the first time she heard it, not because she was upset, but because in that simple sound was the proof that Ava remembered too, even if she couldn't explain it, and as she learned to walk, she did it by holding Scout's fur. Tiny fingers tangled in the golden waves along his back, and Scout never moved too quickly, never pulled away. Always waited for her to find her balance, and when she fell, he licked her cheek before she could cry, and when she began to speak in full sentences. Scout was the first she told about her imaginary friends, about the tea parties she threw with mismatched cups, and about the monsters she thought might be under her bed. And when preschool started, Ava cried not because of the separation, but because she wanted Scout to come with her. Emily would have to explain again and again that dogs weren't allowed in classrooms, even the brave ones, and Ava would nod solemnly and say, "But what if someone stops breathing?" And the teachers didn't know what she meant at first, till Emily told them the story, and even then. They thought she might be exaggerating until they saw it. The way Scout walked Ava to the edge of the driveway and waited until the bus turned the corner, how he returned to the front porch and sat there until it returned, tail thumping softly the moment it reappeared. And this ritual continued for years, Scout walking her out and Scout welcoming her back. And by the time Ava was in second grade, he was mentioned in her About My Hero essay, complete with a drawing of a golden dog with a cape that said Dr. Scout and the teacher, not knowing the full story, sent a note home asking if Scout had some sort of medical certification, and Emily laughed for the first time in weeks when she read it, and wrote back, "No, but maybe he should." And as the years passed, so did the milestones. Ava's first lost tooth, her first scraped knee, her first piano recital, and in every photo there was Scout, sometimes beside her, sometimes behind her, always watching, and no one questioned it anymore. Not the mailman who left bones inside packages. Not the neighbor who built a doggy ramp so Scout could join Ava in her treehouse. Not even the family across the street who didn't like dogs but left a water bowl out near the sidewalk because they said it felt wrong not to. And while Ava was growing taller and braver and louder, Scout began to slow, not dramatically at first, but in the subtle ways old dogs do. He no longer chased the ball as quickly. He preferred shorter walks. He took more naps in sunlit corners. And when he climbed the stairs, he did it one at a time carefully. Like he was measuring each step, and Ava noticed. Of course she did. And she started walking slower too, adjusting to his pace without being asked. And when he didn't make it all the way upstairs one night, she carried her blanket down and slept beside him on the floor, whispering bedtime stories into his ear the way Emily used to whisper them to her. And Emily, standing quietly in the hallway, felt her heart ache in the most beautiful way, because in that dimly lit living room, she saw the loop of love come full circle. The baby who had once been protected now becoming the protector. There was one moment just after Ava turned 9, when Scout, now graying around the muzzle, tried to stand too quickly and stumbled slightly, and Ava caught him, wrapped her arms around his neck and said, "It's okay, I've got you now." And for Emily, watching from the kitchen, it was like watching a soul gently pass a torch, not of duty, but of love. And even Jordan, who had always been practical, always focused on bills and schedules and work deadlines, began waking up early just to sit with Scout on the porch. Coffee in hand, the two of them staring out into the morning like old men who had nothing left to prove. And Scout would place his head on Jordan's knee, and sometimes Jordan would say, "I haven't forgotten." Not 1 second. And Scout would close his eyes like he believed it. Because he did. And one day, in late autumn, after the leaves had all fallen and the first frost made the windows fog over in the mornings, Scout didn't get up with the alarm, didn't walk Ava to the door, and when Ava came back inside in a panic, Emily found Scout still curled on his bed, awake but not moving, his breathing shallow, his eyes calm, and she knew, not because anyone said it, but because something in the air shifted, and she called Jordan, and he came home early. And they made a call to the vet, and then sat beside Scout for hours, brushing his fur, feeding him peanut butter from a spoon, and Ava never left his side, whispering things only he would understand. And when the vet arrived, they offered to take him to the clinic, but Emily shook her head and said, "He's never leaving her side again," and they made a bed in the living room, the same place. Where Scout had once laid beside Ava's bassinet, Scout rested his head on Ava's lap, his tail twitching once, twice, and the vet said, "He's not in pain, he's just tired." And Ava said, "You can sleep now." And Emily placed her hand on his chest and felt it rise and fall slower each time, until it didn't rise again, and the room was silent, except for the wind brushing the curtains and the soft sound of Ava's breathing, steady, strong, live the way Scout had always hoped it would be. Some say love disappears when the body does, that grief fades with time and memories lose their sharpness. But the truth is, when love is deep enough, when it's built not from words, but from presence, from devotion, from silent companionship, in moments of terror and in seasons of joy, that love doesn't end. It roots itself into everything, into how you walk, how you speak, how you pause before turning off the light. And that's what Scout left behind. Not just a story, not just a memory, but a way of living. A quiet reminder that some beings give all of themselves and ask for nothing in return. And the day after he passed, Ava didn't speak much. Not because she didn't want to, but because the house felt so quiet, too quiet, like it had lost its heartbeat, and Emily let her grieve in her own way. Watching from the doorway as Ava lay curled on Scout's old bed, one of his toys held against her chest, and that night, instead of her usual bedtime story, Ava whispered a story to Scout, her voice barely louder than the wind, telling him how much she loved him, how she knew he was tired, how she would keep being brave for him. And when she fell asleep mid-sentence, Emily carried her to bed gently, tucking the blanket Scout used to sleep on around her like a protective hug. And the next morning, Jordan dug a small place beneath the old oak tree in their backyard, one Scout had always loved to nap under. They laid him to rest wrapped in Ava's favorite baby blanket, the same one that had once covered her when she slept beside his paws. And beside the grave, they placed a flat stone with his name carved in it, and beneath that, for words that Ava insisted on writing herself, he made me breathe, and for weeks after, neighbors came by to place flowers, to leave drawings, to tell their own stories about Scout. Stories Ava had never heard. Like how he once walked a neighbor's child home after he'd scraped his knee on the sidewalk, or how he would sit at the edge of the porch when it rained, as if guarding the house from the storm itself, and Ava listened to each one, wide-eyed, heart full, like she was collecting pieces of him to hold forever. And slowly, the grief began to change shape, from a sharp ache to something softer, something woven into her routine, like the way she still said good morning to the tree every day, or how she still reached out her hand at night to the spot beside her bed before remembering he wasn't there, and when her school asked each student to bring in something that reminded them of courage, Ava brought Scout's collar, still clipped with the medal he had been given at the hospital, and stood in front of her class, hands trembling, slightly, voice quiet but clear, and told the story, not of how she stopped breathing, but of how someone loved her enough to notice, to act, to stay. And when she finished, her classmates clapped softly, not because they were told to, but because something inside them understood that they'd just heard something real, something that would stay with them. And from that moment on, Scout wasn't just Ava's dog, he became the school's guardian too. A mural was painted in the hallway, showing him lying peacefully beside a crib, his eyes watchful, and below it were the words, "Some heroes have 4 legs," and years passed, as years do, Ava growing taller, her voice stronger, her questions deeper, and though other dogs came into their life, a bouncy retriever named Sunny, a rescued mutt named Clover, none of them replaced Scout, not in Ava's heart, not in the way she walked or smiled or paused in moments of silence like she was still listening for his breath. And when Ava turned 16, she got her first job volunteering at an animal shelter, walking dogs, comforting them, whispering gently through cage doors. And everyone noticed how they responded to her, how even the shyest dogs leaned into her touch, how she knew just when to speak and when to sit in silence. And Emily, watching her from the car window one afternoon, said softly to herself, "He's still with her," and he was. In every decision she made, in the way she noticed the ones no one else did, in the way she waited before rushing. And when Ava graduated high school, she gave a speech not about grades or achievements, but about Scout, about the night she didn't breathe and the years she learned how to, about how love can speak without sound and save you without lifting a paw. And the auditorium was silent, the kind of silence that isn't empty, but sacred. And when she walked off stage, the entire crowd stood, not because they had to, but because they'd just been reminded of something they'd forgotten, that goodness still exists. Quiet, loyal, waiting on the porch. And Ava went on to study veterinary medicine, driven not by ambition, but by gratitude, by the desire to give back the way Scout had. And during her college years, she returned home often, always stopping by the tree, her fingers brushing the stone, whispering updates to the soil like she believed he still listened. And maybe he did, because sometimes, on the quietest nights, Emily would swear she heard the sound of paws on the stairs, the soft thump of a tail against the hallway wall. And Jordan, long skeptical of such things, began leaving the porch light on again, just in case, and Ava never stopped talking about him, never stopped carrying him forward. And when she opened her own veterinary practice years later, she named it Scout's Heart. And in the lobby, just above the front desk, hung a framed photo of a golden retriever beside a crib, beside a baby girl, beside a life he helped save. And below it were the same words Ava had once carved into stone. "He made me breathe," and people came from far away to see it, not just for care, but for comfort. To sit in the waiting room and read the story printed on the wall, and to tell their own, and in the quiet corners of her clinic, Ava would often sit on the floor beside the older dogs, her hand resting gently on their heads, whispering things only they seemed to understand. And whenever someone asked her why she became a vet, she would smile, not always answer right away, and then tell them the story, not as a tragedy, but as a beginning. A love letter to the dog who never needed words, who never left her side. And if you asked her now, all these years later, what she believes dogs really are, she wouldn't say. Pets, or animals, or companions, she'd say they're reminders. Breathing reminders that the most powerful love is often the quietest, that the deepest protection is often unnoticed, and that sometimes the one who saves you doesn't wear a cape or speak your language, but watches you while you sleep and stays close when you need them most. So if you're watching this, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, we want to ask you, has a dog ever changed your life? Did they wait beside you, watch over you, love you, when no one else could? Tell us below where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And maybe share a little story about the dog that stayed, because chances are you've had one, too, a scout of your own, and maybe tonight before you go to sleep. You'll remember the way they looked at you, the way they never asked for anything, and the way their love, quiet and unwavering, which made you breathe just a little easier. Forever.